And it's BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Thursday, time for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And because today is Thursday, I actually have a special guest for you. This is the honeybee, and quite different than the fox who normally comes by on Thursdays. But what you guys might want to know about this is genuine river prawn pottery, and the honeybee is going to be welcomed to Black Box Online Radio. True Crime Talk Radio is a segment where I talk about multiple stories under a single umbrella episode. And it looks like we already have some people in the live chat. We have DNA King who says howdy. Howdy to you too, DNA King. We have Andrew WVA who says good morning to everyone. Andrew, good morning to you, my brother from West Virginia. And we have Tyler Scott here who says good morning to all. That's right, very nicely done. In this episode, I will be discussing the story of JonBenet Ramsey and the book The Cases That Haunt Us by John Douglas. Some of you who follow this channel will remember that I've talked about some of John Douglas's other observations in this book, The Cases That Haunt Us, with the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper. I have standalone episodes on both of these, and you can find them here on BBO War. BBO War is also available on Spotify for free downloads under the name Black Box Podcast. But in this episode, I want to focus on his section in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, that talks about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey from 1996. JonBenet Ramsey was found to be missing, first of all, the day after Christmas, and her mother walked down the stairs and found a 3-page ransom note, which is actually 2.5 pages, but written on 3 pages of paper. And later that day, JonBenet Ramsey was found dead in the basement of her home in Boulder, Colorado. Now, I want to be very clear about something. John Douglas is the author of The Cases That Haunt Us, and he is also the most influential person on the history of criminal profiling that the FBI has ever had. And somebody was talking about this on a different episode when I was discussing John Douglas and The Cases That Haunt Us, and they said, Ned, who are you to challenge John Douglas? He's done all of these things, and do you know more about true crime than him? And my short response is, no, I don't. Well, are you trying to say that you're some type of bigger authority on this subject than he is? No, I am not. That's why he wrote the book and I am reading it. That's why he wrote the book and I am learning from it. Now, with that being said, I have, read through his stuff on the Zodiac Killer, and that was pretty good, except he accepted a lot of the unconfirmed Zodiac Killer communications into his psychological assessment of the Zodiac, things that aren't completely certain to have been the Zodiac. And his stuff on Jack the Ripper, I also think is very good. But even though I have just given you guys this disclaimer, with the story of JonBenet Ramsey, I think that John Douglas is wrong about almost everything. And you can take it for what you will. I'm just some guy who's reading the book and like, wait a second, how on earth does that make any sense? So I think that is going to be the focus of this episode, because I openly tell you guys, that's what I do here on Black Box Online Radio. This is a social commentary channel, because you guys must have these experiences too when you're just reading a book and you're like, I don't quite understand what the author is trying to say about this. I don't agree with that statement. This doesn't make sense to me. So let's provide a little bit of an introduction. And first we can say, good afternoon, Ned. We have William Kane. William Kane, you're in the UK, right? Anthony is here, says, good morning from Adelaide, Australia. Hey, good morning to you too. And John Douglas, lady, is going to make a comeback. Oh, that's a person that follows the show. But yes, that's from Charlie Don't Serve. Charlie is here. And Charlie says, hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. Thanks, Charlie. Okay, and Anthony says, I think it is a good idea to question assessments and opinions of those in authority. No one is absolute in authority. Sure, excellent. Now, here's some things, though, with the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. As previously stated, she disappeared sometime on the night of Christmas into December 26th of 1997. And as previously stated, there was the 3-page ransom note she's found in the basement. And before JonBenet was discovered, her mother, Patsy Ramsey, made a phone call, and she stated that her daughter was missing. She found this note that says SBTC Victory. What on earth does that mean? And a detective arrives at the house, Detective Linda Arndt. And she even tells the father, John Ramsey, that he can search the house, and he even has a friend over there, Fleet White. And she says, search the house from top to bottom. But John Ramsey doesn't listen. He searches the house from the bottom to the top, and he finds JonBenet's body in a room that is referred to as the wine cellar. This is a room in the basement, although it was primarily just used for storage. I know that most of you guys who are following this episode are familiar with this. Just a little bit of an introduction. But JonBenet had duct tape over her mouth, her hands were tied above her head, and it appeared that some type of post-mortem rigor mortis had kicked in, and she was very, very stiff. John Ramsey brought her upstairs to the living room, and then Linda Arndt allowed John to cover her with a white blanket. Now, the stuff that John Douglas talks about is, he did get to work on this case. Of course, he didn't work on Jack the Ripper. Of course, he didn't work on the Zodiac case decades before his time. But he did work, assist, and consult on the Ramsey case. And he came to the conclusion that the Ramseys were not responsible, not John Ramsey, the father, not Patsy Ramsey, the mother, not Burke Ramsey, the son. And he believed that an outside intruder was responsible for the attempted botched kidnapping and ultimately the murder. And I told you that I thought John Douglas was wrong about almost everything. But in all reality, just from looking into this case in the past on Black Box Online Radio, I came to a very similar conclusion. I also believe that an intruder was responsible. A lot of people think I always give wavering opinions in the Zodiac Killer mystery. I'm like, I don't know who the Zodiac was. But with the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, I clearly state that I think that it was an intruder, and there's several reasons. But first, it's not only the conclusion that you reach, it's also the method that you use to reach the conclusion. And that's the stuff that I think John Douglas is completely off the map with. And Lacey is here. She says, good morning, Ned and everyone. Good morning to you too, Lacey. Welcome to True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. Anthony says, this case has confused the hell out of me. The initial handling of the case on the morning of the murder was handled very poorly. Tardigrade Hatchling is here, who says, I used to be convinced that the parents were suspicious, but I think it's painfully clear. Oh, I think it's the painter or the cleaner's husband. Okay, now, Tardigrade Hatchling, the cleaner's husband, his name is Mervyn, right? I don't necessarily want to just throw out people's names onto the internet. But let's look at some of the reasons why John Douglas thinks that it's the Ramseys, and why does he challenge this popular belief? Number one, in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, it talks about how John Douglas is critical of all kinds of people in the general public who are saying that it was the Ramseys, John, Patsy, or Burke. And he says that they are relying too much on statistics for their evidence. That's how the section in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, begins. And I was thinking, statistics? When I am just sitting back and watching videos about this case online, they rarely talk about the statistics. What statistic would you be talking about? There were 4 people in the house, and one of them ended up dead. Is that one of the statistics you're talking about? And again, the second thing that he used to introduce the subject was people relied too much on news and gossip from the tabloids. Now, the tabloids is most likely referring to the set of publications that came out in the 1990s when this thing was going on contemporarily, particularly the Globe. The Globe was very famed for talking about the Ramsey case. And in all seriousness, I don't think anybody took that stuff seriously. The people who closely follow the JonBenet Ramsey case don't really care at all what the tabloids had to say, because they recognize that they are unreliable sources. Moreover, they may have made a little bit of noise. They may have gotten people's attention, but people don't actually care what's in those tabloids because they know it's not actually trying to solve the mystery. So then the next point about why John Douglas is saying that people have just sort of misunderstood the way that the Ramseys and their actions would have gone about would be that this is actually, I can actually get this one for you too. This is even discussed in the book, The Other Side of Suffering by John Ramsey, when he says that in an instance where a family member is murdered by another family member and they call in the authorities and it's reported themselves, that this would indicate, well, what indicates that another family member is involved is if the body is placed in a peaceful and almost memorial-like way. And JonBenet Ramsey was not found like that. As said, she's tied up, duct tape over the mouth, and she had all types of things that were done to her, which I'm not going to say on YouTube, but bad things that are done to children. And he's like, that's not how people would handle a family member in that situation. Now, I first read that in The Other Side of Suffering, and I've responded to John Douglas in the past on this channel, and I was just thinking, that is utter nonsense. That's the whole point. The crime scene was staged to look like somebody else. What would they do or something? Write some little note like, "Oh, mommy and daddy always love you" or something, and leave that with the body, staging the scene in a peaceful and memorial like way? No, they would stage the scene in a way that would look like an intruder did it. If, I openly told you I don't think they're guilty, but if, right? And Tyler Scott has a comment. I'm on the fence, but I think it's someone that lived with JonBenet. Still not sure which one, but maybe everyone was involved. Okay, though. But this whole thing about how a family member is going to murder another family member and they're going to stage the scene in a way that is peaceful and memorial like. What John Douglas shared in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, is an explanation as to how and why he came to those observations. Most notably, he was a profiler on a different true crime case where a husband murdered his wife and he tried to make it look like an intruder did it. He's making phone calls throughout the workday and no one's answering. Then he calls a neighbor who had a key to the house. The neighbor goes over and finds the body. And then the body was wrapped in a white blanket in, again, some peaceful and memorial like way, even though it was staged to look like an intruder. And then the forensic evidence ultimately traced it back to the husband, and he was found to be guilty. So that is what has influenced John Douglas's thinking in a certain way. And I was like, maybe in that specific instance, maybe in that specific case, somebody staged a crime scene rather poorly. But if the intention is to make it look like an intruder did it, maybe they actually staged the scene to look like an intruder did it. I mean, that's just something that just seems so obvious to me. The next thing that is mentioned in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, John Ramsey finds JonBenet with duct tape over her mouth, and he removes the duct tape. Now, he was the first person to touch the duct tape and the person to remove it. And John Douglas openly asks a question to the reader in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, by saying, if he had staged the crime scene, why would he unstage the crime scene? Again, it's so simple because he's trying to make it look like someone else did it. I'm not accusing him. I absolutely am not. But just this line of thinking that's put forward by John Douglas, just about, it makes no sense if he were to make it look like an intruder actually murdered his daughter, but it was someone inside the house. That's the whole point. That's the point of staging a crime scene. And another thing, though, that seems painfully obvious to me is that this whole concept of why would somebody put duct tape over the victim's mouth and be the first person to remove the duct tape? When people are putting on an act and a facade, sometimes they go with it. Sometimes they go with it in an unwavering way. Sometimes they don't pretend for a second like they know it's all an act or they all know it's all a lie, and they don't miss a beat. And I think that somebody like John Douglas would have been fooled by a convincing acting job. And in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, he openly tells John Ramsey when he meets him that either you are the best liar in the world or you're innocent. And the point of this segment is not so much to put the focus on the Ramseys. It is to just show that this type of reasoning that John Douglas is employing in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, is one that doesn't really quite make a whole lot of sense to me. Susie Q is here, just tuning in. Fascinating but tragic story. Really hope that it would have been solved by now. Well, the Ramseys appeared on television 13 days after JonBenet was murdered or whatever it was, and they said that they thought the killer would be caught by then. They thought that the killer would have been identified. And I'm a little bit shocked that this case has not been solved. And there is, there are countless explanations as to why. One of them would be that the investigation was botched from the beginning. And here's an example of something. I told you that the first detective on the scene was Linda Arndt. She's mentioned in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us by John Douglas. And Linda Arndt gave a very famous interview on television when she's just saying that John Ramsey was cordial. Well, did he say anything to you? He was cordial. What do you mean, cordial? You must have seen that, right? And Detective Linda Arndt openly stated that She just felt like, chills running down her spine. She had to count the bullets in her gun, and she had 18 bullets, even though there weren't 18 people in the house, but she found that that was relieving. And ultimately, Linda Arndt did not directly accuse John Ramsey, the father, of being the murderer of JonBenet, but she heavily implied it. And it's even discussed in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us. He's like, Linda Arndt clearly implied that she thought that John Ramsey was guilty of the murder. Now, somebody's saying, why hasn't this case been solved? Well, what John Douglas does is he openly calls out Linda Arndt and says, if you had all these suspicions about John Ramsey, they weren't included in her reports. And what exactly is the basis for her thinking that he looked at her in a way that she didn't like, so she thought that he might be up to something? But anyway, he's just like, her suspicions about John Ramsey were not included in her initial reports. So you can take that for what you will. Andrew WVA says, I read that the parents did not appear concerned when the phone call regarding the ransom delivery was never made between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. that morning. And Anthony says, even if we don't know who committed the murder, the ransom letter is bizarre. Who other than Mrs. Ramsey would have written such a letter? Andrew says, why ask for that amount of money? And New Cokes says, what's up, Ned? Hey, what's up, Vincent from New Cokes 2024. All right, so we have a lot of questions about the ransom note. Let's talk about that a little bit more. The ransom note, again, was 2.5 pages, and it says, Dear Mr. Ramsey. Although there was an original first draft where someone was starting to write this out, and they said, Dear Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, but that is a draft. The ransom note was written on the notepad that was found in the Ramsey household with one of the felt-tip pens that was also found in the Ramsey household. The ransom note goes on to say that they have kidnapped JonBenet. They represent a small foreign faction. They respect your business, but not the government that it serves. And it goes on to say that John needs to get an attaché case and bring $118,000 to a specific location that will be revealed later. And as somebody said in the chat, they'll call between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. It's, what is it? $100,000 needs to be in $100 bills and 18,000 in 20s or something like that. Not important, though. And then the journey will be exhausting, so John needs to be well rested. And if they contact anyone, JonBenet will be murdered. The person who wrote the ransom note also specified that 3 people were involved, the writer and 2 men who were watching JonBenet. At least 3 people were involved, and it was signed SBTC Victory. Now, one of the questions was, why ask for that amount of money? $118,000 was close to the amount of money that John Ramsey received for an annual bonus, which was actually the bonus of 1995. So he received that in January of 1996. It was like, I guess you could say, last year's bonus. So what happens with that? Why that specific amount of money? It appears that John Ramsey possibly knew the attacker, whoever killed JonBenet. Now, I know people are going to think that could be John himself. It appears that John Ramsey had some connection to the murderer of JonBenet, because that's a very specific piece of information that someone who close to him should have known. But as far as who wrote the note, I read it a million times. I have a whole episode about the ransom note here on this channel. It's discussed in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us. And here's something where John Douglas and I would be on the same page. And just by saying, I absolutely don't think that it was a woman who wrote that. Or at the very least, I don't think a woman composed it. Because some people believe that it's not John Ramsey's handwriting, it's Patsy Ramsey's handwriting. However, the tone, the structure, the details, all of that seems extremely masculine. So they think that it's a man dictating the words to a woman, and she is just writing down everything that he is saying verbatim. How does this work with an intruder? Well, what they put forward is, by they, I mean anybody who thinks that it was an intruder of any kind, is the intruder was stalking JonBenet for an extended period of time, maybe even weeks. This person broke into their home in a very, very stealthily way, sneaking through an unlocked door when it was available, and waiting for them to come back from their Christmas party. So they're already in the house and they wouldn't be triggering alarms. And that's why they wrote a 2.5-page ransom note, waiting for them to come home. And they're just writing this thing down to pass time and to, well, waste a little bit of time until the Ramseys came home. Now, that's a little bit hard to say. And Victoria says the parents aren't involved. I don't believe so either, Victoria. And I'll go through all the reasons why. And Andrew says, how do you know they aren't? So he's responding to Victoria. Now, I'm being very clear. I don't believe they were involved, but let's see. And Christopher says SBTC. Now, what is SBTC? The saying at the end of the ransom note. Some people have said that it's the name of the foreign faction and they're telling the truth. Other people have said that it means saved by the cross and it's actually referring to something from the Bible. And oh, there's another thing from one of the Psalms. It actually says something about not saved by the cross. There's something else that has the letters SBTC in it, but it's a biblical reference, all of the same. And what I think is so interesting is I have to give a shout out to someone who used to follow my old JonBenet Ramsey episodes named Professor Stewart. And what he said was that, he's a professor and he thought that the ransom note was written by somebody who didn't have English as their first language and they were trying to overcompensate, make it look like English was their first language. That begs the question of why call it a foreign faction. I guess foreign countries could be outside of America that speak English, whatever. I retract that statement. But I was watching an interview with John Ramsey on Megyn Kelly's show on Sirius, and he also found a linguistic expert that supported that theory, completely unrelated to Professor Stewart, watching Black Box Online Radio, of course. But they were just saying that they thought that it was someone most likely from a Spanish speaking country who learned English as a second language and they were trying to overcompensate. And I'm like, whoa, that should narrow down your suspect pool a little bit, right? If that were actually true. Now, is that true? I don't know that the author of that note was Latino. But here's something that Megyn Kelly brought up. And this is one of her observations, not from the book The Cases That Haunt Us. This is from that interview that I was watching with John Ramsey. Megyn Kelly said that there was this word that was used. John Ramsey is supposed to bring an attaché case to get the money. And she just thought, that's a bizarre thing. That's a bizarre thing that people don't normally say. And I actually saw a video from a different YouTuber named Salone who referred to it as the attach case. Bring an appropriate size attach. I don't think that's weird at all. Attaché case. You've seen them in the movies, right? You've seen people carry money in an attaché case in the movies, and they talk about them in movies and TV shows. Very, very normal to use those types of words and that type of lingo. So I don't think there's anything weird or bizarre about that. Now, to get back to the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, what would be some other evidence that John Douglas puts forward to say that the parents were not involved? Number one, when people construct these theories that Patsy Ramsey just lost it and she snapped and she hit JonBenet over the head, and that the scene was staged by John Ramsey. She goes to the husband, says she made a terrible mistake, and then he's the one who ties the garrote that was actually used to strangle her. She was hit in the head once with a very powerful amount of force. She had an 8.5-inch crack in her skull, but the thing that ultimately killed her was strangulation, manual strangulation with a garrote. The garrote was made from materials inside the family's home, including a paintbrush that was owned by Patsy Ramsey. And he's just saying, if Patsy had lost it and just hit her daughter, if Burke had lost it and just hit his sister, where was the physical evidence? Where was the single drop of blood spatter that they forgot to clean up? Where was the single fiber from anything that was up behind? Where was the single hair from JonBenet that was found on any blunt object, that was found in the bathroom, that was found in the kitchen, that was found in the hallway? Where was any of the physical evidence that was left behind? And right now, I'm just giving that one to him. I'm giving that one to him because that's something that I'm mostly in agreement on. I told you that I thought an intruder did this because one of the largest theories out there does not involve the parents. It involves Burke Ramsey. And Burke is one of the most widely discussed suspects on the internet in regards to the JonBenet Ramsey case. And what you guys will hear is that Burke comes home from the Christmas party with his parents, right? And they're changed into their pajamas. He pours a glass of tea, and he makes a bowl of pineapple and milk. And he's sitting there eating the pineapple, and JonBenet starts teasing him. She's been the center of attention for 6 years. No one has thought about Burke at all since he was 3 years old. Patsy and JonBenet also have this thing about JonBenet participating in pageants together. And, Burke is just the overlooked child. And, he is jealous of the attention she gets. She starts making fun of him, laughing, joking, teasing. and she reaches into his bowl of pineapple, pulls up a single piece of pineapple, and starts eating it. That's how they found undigested pineapple in her system. Then Burke loses it. He just freaks out and starts running around, chasing her, and he grabs some type of blunt object and strikes her over the head. Now, she's not dead yet from the head wound, but then he just realizes he's done something terrible. His parents realize he's done something terrible, but they don't want to call the police because it's the whole concept of we've already lost JonBenet, we don't want to lose Burke too. You guys know this theory. You have heard it 1,000 times. So, what exactly would John Douglas say in response to that, other than what I already told you? Well, where's the blood evidence? Where are the fibers that they forgot to find? Where are the hair samples that they forgot to find? If there was a blunt object in the house that was used, where was it? And was it... I mean, again, the physical evidence does not seem to be in support of that. So, as far as the alternative thing that is shared in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, here is something that I disagree with. John Douglas proposes that, number one, John Ramsey didn't abuse the kids. Number two, Patsy Ramsey didn't abuse the kids. Number three, Burke Ramsey didn't have a big history of violence with JonBenet. Therefore, it's not normal for someone to just snap and strike their kid, giving a fatal wound. Bear in mind, this is actually in one of the medical examiner's reports that someone sent me for one of my older episodes. JonBenet would have died from the head wound. There's even a documentary where Detective Lou Smith is being interviewed, and he says it was non-lethal. But in response to that, someone sent me one of the medical examiner's report that said, yes, it was lethal. She would have died from it. So how does all of this just come together? I mean, how does John Douglas say that people don't just snap and hit their kid in a way that could have killed them? I think that that's absolute BS. I think that's garbage. I think it makes no sense at all. Have you ever known somebody that didn't really get furiously angry about something? One day they just snapped. One day they just punch a wall. One day they just freak out and they have some type of meltdown. And I know that getting mad and punching a wall isn't the same as beating a kid over the head, but people do things like that. You want to talk about blood evidence? DNA? Hair found on blunt objects in the house? Sure, I'm in agreement with that stuff. But to say that somebody can't just snap after having a moment of intensity, a one lapse of judgment, I don't agree with that type of thinking in any single way. And Newcoke says, 8.5-inch crack in the skull? Yes. Serious hit. There should be blood somewhere. Did they lumen all the house? They must have. As far as I know, they scoured the house. And John Douglas actually wanted to clear up a rumor because he said that John Ramsey actually had one of his books, one of John Douglas's books, on the nightstand that was talking all about staging crime scenes. And John Douglas said that if you read that on the internet, it's not true. That was never entered into evidence. Now, Andrew says, it didn't break the skin, though, did it? Well, Andrew, I don't really know if it didn't break the skin or not. What I do remember that's widely talked about is it wasn't noticed immediately, meaning that it was something that was not immediately visible to the naked eye, like when they picked her up. And, of course, John Ramsey is going to be overwhelmed with emotion, but the head wound was not noticed immediately. I'm not sure about breaking the skin, but you would think when they did the reenactment, though, on the CBS documentary, knock on wood, don't sue me, Burke, that showed them very clearly breaking that. But okay, see, Andrew's got something else here. Burke Ramsey once hit her with a golf club. Yes, right. This thing about there's no physical abuse in the house. Number one, how does John Douglas know that? What? Because John and Patsy Ramsey say there's no physical abuse? How do you know that? Number two, Burke Ramsey did have an incident where he hit JonBenet in the face with a golf club. The family has chalked that up to being an accident. They said they went to a driving range or golf course of sorts. I mean, Burke was just trying to hit a golf ball, and he followed through with the swing, and he accidentally hit JonBenet in the face. It was a pure accident. Well, what would they say? Seriously, what would they say? Oh, yeah, my kid has a history of violence. I just never did anything about it. I mean, you can't really expect them to just admit to something like that, but they have addressed that, and at the very least, that has been talked about. But here's something, though, that is mentioned in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us. And this challenge to all of these things about how the Ramseys did not abuse their children. What John Douglas said was, after talking to hundreds, if not thousands, of people for his criminal interviews that he does with the FBI, he can spot fake tears. He can most likely tell if someone is genuinely crying and expressing sorrow and when they are not. I do not like that type of thinking. I do not like that at all. New Coke's 2024, Vincent, has a video out on his channel just talking about how you can't just appeal to authority and be like, oh, yeah, it's because the expert says so. Well, why not? Because experts can be fooled. And it sounds so obvious when we're just kind of sitting back here in the far off corners of YouTube. You guys follow true crime cases. You know that experts can be fooled. Not in the mainstream world and not in their minds. They think they're experts. They think they can never be deceived. So I think that that's just another thing that's mentioned in the book. And I'm just discussing the book, The Cases That Haunt Us. But I told you, I disagreed with almost everything that John Douglas said. I also disagree with that. I told you already once in this episode, I think that he could be fooled by a convincing acting job. There's a second reason. It's because he thinks he's above that. No, I'm an expert. I could never be fooled by a convincing acting job. Sorry, sir. Jim Minshall is here. Some of the language used in the ransom note were lines from movies. I believe Speed was one of those movies. I think the Ramseys had a Speed movie poster. Yes, it's mentioned in the movie Speed. You're talking about the line in the ransom note that says, "Don't grow a brain, John." It could have also been referring to the movie Ransom. And Jim Minshall says, the Ramseys were avid movie fans, from what I understand. I'll take your word for it. Anthony says, Burke is an easy target. His interview with Dr. Phil was terrible. A miscalculation. In my opinion, as a parent with an autistic son and a medical practitioner, he absolutely has ASD. ASD, do you mean autism spectrum disorder? No, Burke does have a mild form of autism, but I'm not sure the exact diagnosis. And that's why he did this interview with Dr. Phil. And he's just kind of laughing at a lot of things. And during the Megyn Kelly interview, John Ramsey openly said, that's absolutely not abnormal. He was just laughing. But here's this. This is the thing that I can't get over, that I have said countless times on Black Box Online Radio. It wasn't completely the head wound that killed JonBenet. She was reported to have died by the medical examiners from manual strangulation partnered with the head wound. Manual strangulation from the garrote. No matter what theory you're going with, you're telling me that two parents strangled their own kid to death when they weren't completely sure that she was dead, so it would make it look like she wasn't dead? I mean, like, what really are you saying? Oh, well, she got hit in the head, so then let's strangle her to death? I know what you guys are saying. They weren't checking vitals. They probably assumed that she was dead. And number three, this is the one that's really hard to talk about online. Maybe, just maybe, there was some type of abuse going on involving, let's say, a father, and some things that begin with S and A that are done to children. And they didn't want the hospital finding out about that, so they staged the scene to look like an intruder. You guys have heard that theory a million times. However, number one, there was DNA that was found on JonBenet's waistband, DNA that was found on JonBenet's leggings, touch DNA that was found on her body, all not matching the Ramseys. And another thing that John Ramsey says in all of his public appearances is, not only did it not match him, it didn't match any of the family members. No partial match in any single way. So that's another point that shows that the Ramseys didn't do it. Number three, there was also a pubic hair that was found on JonBenet's blanket, I believe. And then that is also not matching the Ramseys. And in the book that I just showed you, The Other Side of Suffering, John Ramsey is the one talking about how he provided pubic hair samples, and Patsy Ramsey also provided pubic hair samples, and they did not match. John Douglas this time, he talks about this in The Cases That Haunt Us, saying he is completely aware of what you guys know as well. Number one, yes, the DNA could have gotten on her in some other way. Someone else has contact with her leggings. Yes, the pubic hair could have gotten on the blanket if someone else had been using it. I admit that too. It's possible. I just think that it's horribly unlikely. And New Cokes is here saying, not always, but in general, it's fair to operate with those assumptions if one is intending to fool law enforcement. And okay, I think I missed something in the chat. I got to scroll up because you guys are very, very active in the chat today. And thank you, by the way, for tuning into Black Box Online Radio. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And I go live every Tuesday and Thursday for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. And I'm talking to you guys all about different stories. But most of the True Crime Talk Radio episodes are focused on forensics, criminal psychology, and criminology. So you can put anything you want in the chat. This is a different one where I'm talking about the story of JonBenet Ramsey. But I'm going to try my best to also take your requests. I also do episodes every Monday about the Zodiac Killer, every Wednesday about Jack the Ripper, and every Friday about Cooper. Cooper, yeah, there's only one right now, DB Cooper. But thank you again for tuning into this episode and participating in the chat. Waste Management says, do you think if the family was the poor police, do you think if the family was poor, the police would have pushed further? Yes, double yes. Mega yes. Infinity plus one yes. They would have been all over the family members. And the PD was all over the Ramseys to a certain extent. Although 60 Minutes Australia did air a video when they said that they did have the DNA technology in 1997 to understand that there was DNA that didn't match the Ramseys. And no matter what, they probably wouldn't have been convicted in a court of law. However, if they had been poor and just not living in, that $1 million household, they would have been hounded by the police. They probably would have spent a lot of nights in jail if they had been poor. And Waste Management says, put more pressure on the family? Yeah. You might even have some wrongful convictions if the family members are poor. And New Coke says, what the fuck? It didn't break the skin. There should be lacerations at minimum from such major force. And the golf club is probably a precedent. Well, as far as like the head wound not breaking the skin, like I said, I just think the most important thing to remember is that it wasn't noticed immediately. And Andrew says, Burke could not have been prosecuted because of his age, but the Ramseys would have been unaware of that on that morning. This gets brought up all the time. Like, Andrew, do you know the exact age? It's just Burke was only 9 years old at the time. He was just short of his 10th birthday. But he was too young to have been convicted of murder. I highly doubt they would have known that. Not saying that he's guilty. I don't think Burke was guilty. I think he's been vilified. But I don't expect that the Ramseys would have known that knowledge. They weren't attorneys. John ran Access Graphics, which worked for Lockheed Martin. Patsy Ramsey was a stay-at-home mom. She was a former Miss West Virginia. You always have to love that state no matter what. But, I mean, no, I don't think they would have been aware of that. But I just don't get why they would have made the scene so much worse. By, let's say, JonBenet actually was injured, so they killed their daughter, wrote the ransom note. I think all of that suggests that this was somebody who broke into the house, who was waiting in the house, and wrote the ransom note to pass the time, waited for them to come back. And, here's something that's mentioned in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, that I, again, think is really, really weird. John Douglas is the expert, and I am not, but he brought about a question about how could undigested pineapple enter JonBenet's system if her parents didn't report it. Firstly, he thinks that if they had given her the pineapple, she would have, by she, I mean Patsy or John Ramsey would have just come forward with that. Yeah, she was eating pineapple at the table and such, and this and that happened. But the Ramseys just said they didn't know about it. And he's like, that's actually a sign of innocence. If they knew that what is happening, they would have just made some type of phony cover story. But they said, I don't know. Okay. What John Douglas is talking about in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, is what if the intruder gave JonBenet the pineapple? What does he do? Like, break into her bedroom, put his hand over her mouth, and be like, oh yeah, by the way, don't scream. I'm going to give you this piece of pineapple that I just conveniently stole from your brother's bowl. Well, bear in mind, without touching the bowl, because only Patsy's fingerprints and Burke's fingerprints were found on the bowl. That is one that I have to put into the category of, I suppose that anything is possible, but what are you talking about? Do you really think that that's what happened? Actually, what I think is that John Ramsey was trying to create a timeline of this for 60 Minutes Australia. He said even though that it's been decades, he believes that he got home from the Christmas party with the family, and JonBenet was put to bed around 10 o'clock. You must have seen some reenactments of this. John is even carrying her from the car and putting her into bed. They get home around 10 o'clock. Burke goes to bed shortly after, maybe 10:15, 10:20, and the Ramseys go to bed at 10:30. That's a recollection. What I think happened was they just went to sleep for a while, and JonBenet got out of the bed, went downstairs, and she picked the pineapple out of the bowl by herself. I mean, it's not impossible for kids to do that, and it's also not uncommon for kids to do that. I did stuff like that all the time. But as far as the intruder giving her the pineapple, what is a way to stay quiet? Like I said, I just that just seems so bizarre. Steve Allen is here, and Steve Allen says the letter seems to be written by Patsy, but I'm still not sure. I confess it has very similar handwriting. I confess that it seems much longer than what you would expect. I confess that it doesn't seem like a standard kidnapping note. It almost would be just like, we have your daughter. Don't call the police. We'll call you between 8 and 10. Boom. Writing 2.5 pages. The only explanation for that, I think, is they did it to pass the time. And also, there is one thing that is discussed by John Douglas and John Ramsey, and that is that in Lou Smith, too, the detective. John Ramsey was just sharing this, that he was given two theories from people who thought that he was innocent. John Douglas proposed that this was a revenge killing that was mostly done to target John Ramsey, although there was definitely an infatuation with JonBenet. Lou Smith proposed that this was a botched kidnapping. They actually wanted to either go through with the ransom note or the illusion that they were going through, because why write the ransom note and leave JonBenet in the basement? And at the bottom of the stairs in the basement and by the window, there was a suitcase that was oddly placed. And fibers from JonBenet's pajamas were found in the suitcase. And one of you guys in the comment section here on Black Box Online Radio even said that I think someone's given the thing, this is my theory. I think that they were trying to put JonBenet in the suitcase and then force her out the window, but they couldn't do it. And then they just abandoned her body there. And that person used the suitcase as a step to get out of the basement window. And that's what happened. So many different theories. But I agree, Patsy Ramsey does have similar handwriting. That Rob guy is here. You would protect what you had left. Oh, you mean that they're thinking we already lost JonBenet, we don't want to lose Burke too? Wallenshred is here. I don't know if the Ramseys did it or not, but I know that wealthy white business people are treated very respectfully by the police and prosecutors. Yeah. Wealthy white people, and if they were poor people of a different background, they might be in jail right now till we speak. Now, Ryan Emmerich says, how do we become an expert? Well, this is how you deal with the Dunning-Kruger effect, right, Ryan? Like, people who are just a little bit informed about something think that they know a lot about it. And then people who have an average amount of experience in something realize that they don't really know that much about it. And then people who are true experts can recognize that they've been through this journey and now they have learned a lot about it. And that's not the pure explanation of the Dunning-Kruger effect, but the first part of it is called the peak of enthusiasm. Yeah, I know what happened. I know this case inside and out. Oh, then you go down into the valley of despair. That's the second part. And you're like, well, I mean, okay, I realize that I was wrong about some things. Then as you learn more, it goes to the slope of enlightenment. Slope of enlightenment. Very valuable things to remember. And then after the slope of enlightenment, you get to the peak of enthusiasm. That's the first one. The plateau of sustainability. The peak of enthusiasm is the first. The plateau of sustainability is the last. These are different dimensions of the Dunning-Kruger effect, because I've also wondered about that. There was just one guy on YouTube once who said, if you are truly an expert, you don't have to say you're an expert. But how many times have you heard somebody say that they're an expert on something? Well, when we talk about handwriting, right? Handwriting expert, that's the name of the people who analyze handwriting. They're called handwriting experts. That aside, I shouldn't even have brought that up. But I was like, if somebody, let's say, if they have studied criminology for 30 years, 40 years, maybe they can call themselves experts. John Douglas is an expert. I want to be clear about that. John Douglas is an expert. I just think that he doesn't do everything perfectly. And Victoria was the one who said this in one of the comments, that maybe one of the reasons why I always have problems with John Douglas is he uses checklists to make determinations about true crime cases. And he even shares this in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, by stating that, all right, what was the time of the last sighting of JonBenet? When was the phone call made? Who was the first person called? Like, there's this checklist that's shared in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us. And no, checklists aren't going to solve anything, really. Now, Andrew says John had previously lost a daughter in a car accident, and then JonBenet. Oh, yes, that's one of the reasons why he titled the book The Other Side of Suffering, that I was showing you at the beginning of the episode, because it's all about confronting situations of grief. And he lost Patsy, too, because of ovarian cancer. Andrew says, I think the ransom note achieved its goal, sending people into all sorts of wild theories and deep dives. I said something similar in the past. I thought that the ransom note was a diversion. It wasn't meant to be real. It's almost like they just wanted to make sure no one came into the basement until they could either get JonBenet out or get themselves out. However, after reading the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, maybe I did learn something. I began to think about it in a different way. Almost that, what if the ransom note were a little bit more genuine than that? I've never really liked the theory that someone wanted to put JonBenet in the suitcase and then force it out the window, then climb out the window themselves. But I began to think more highly of it. I began to think that it was a little bit more likely, and then maybe they didn't really want to claim the ransom note, but they wanted to just give the illusion of it because it was a real kidnapping. I never liked the botched kidnapping theory in the past, but I'm more open to it now. Now, here's another point. JonBenet Ramsey was sexually assaulted. Who did it? Is this the reason why the Ramseys didn't call 911? Let's say if John, Patsy, or Burke committed the murder and they didn't call 911, were they trying to hide the fact that a family member, maybe possibly the father, was sexually assaulting her? And if it was a kidnapper, was an intruder, what would be the background of the intruder to do this? This is discussed in The Cases That Haunt Us, when John Douglas says that there are different types of offenders who target children. And I'm paraphrasing all of this, but some are habitual and some are circumstantial, meaning that even if someone isn't regularly a pedophile, if they were in a situation like they had JonBenet tied up, they might do it. So it's almost impossible to tell the background of the offender, like who would have sexually assaulted JonBenet with a paintbrush, nonetheless. But that's a statement that I do more or less agree with, although it's a very, very general statement. Sometimes people do that, and sometimes they don't. But habitual and circumstantial offenders. Now, Andrew says, Ned, have you ever heard the enhanced 911 call where it sounds like there's a child voice at the end? Oh, yes, absolutely. CBS played that one. That was one of their pieces of evidence for the Burke Ramsey theory. They were saying that Burke's voice can be heard in the background, and they enhanced it, and it does sound like something like he asked them a question or something, because their claim was that Burke was in his bedroom at the time, and was he actually in the background? I don't know. One of the explanations that was provided was that sound was not Burke, and that was actually a piece of electronic equipment or something like the answering machine started. I can't make comments on that. I was like, I just don't know enough to say if that's true or not. It sounds really weird, though. All right, something about being weird. And this goes well beyond John Douglas. This goes back to my favorite saying. What's that? Being weird is not a crime. Because let me share something with you guys. Patsy Ramsey did not do herself any favors when she was being interviewed by the detectives, when she was being interviewed on television. You must have seen the interrogation video of Patsy Ramsey where she said, they ask her about, did you kill your daughter? No. Well, what would you do if we told you that we have evidence that you killed your daughter? And please forgive me if I talk like a West Virginian for a second. Well, I don't give a flying flip what you have. Go back to the damn drawing board. I didn't do it. John Ramsey didn't do it. She does herself no favors because she is just acting very, very strangely. Being weird is not a crime, right? But her word choice, calling her husband John Ramsey in casual statements like that. I mean, telling them to go back to the damn drawing board. And later on, though, what was it? I think it was Megyn Kelly. She played a larger segment when she's like, just she's denying it much more thoroughly as the conversation progressed. But very, very awkward word choices. And, ultimately, I think that Patsy Ramsey had somewhat of an awkward personality. Doesn't mean she did it, though. And Andrew says the reason why there was that extra sound on the phone was Patsy thought she had hung up, but she didn't. Anthony says, is it correct that there were no footprints found outside the basement window despite a snowfall? I heard one source that say yes, and I read one source that said no, that there was a walking path, but you would think there would be some type of footprint of some intruders trying to get out. Until tomorrow, 9 is here. Ned, good morning. Good morning, West Virginia. Good morning, West Virginia. Good morning, world. You're doing JonBenet, one that is always on the back burner. We'll catch your whole show later. I'm in the South, and I have to go out and cut the grass before it's 99 degrees. What is that? Good Southern common sense, good Southern charm? All right, until tomorrow. You can catch the show tomorrow. Couldn't resist. Anthony, yes, the police said that there were no footprints in the snow. Rob says, there was very little snow there, I thought. Yeah, I've heard that too. J.D. Vance is a crime, says Anthony. J.D. Vance is a crime nonetheless. Not my world, not my world. But overall, though, can I just ask you guys, what do you think about these observations that have been made by John Douglas that I've been talking about in this episode that would point toward the Ramseys being innocent? If you think that the Ramseys were guilty, how do you explain the DNA that is found in multiple places that did not come from JonBenet? Of course, it didn't come from JonBenet. That did not come from the Ramseys. How do you explain that? How does that fit into your theory? How does this not show that there was an intruder who was able to get into the house, maybe at some time when the door was unlocked, someone who was stalking JonBenet, possibly with a grudge against John Ramsey, but definitely someone who had an infatuation with JonBenet? And here's something else. A convicted criminal named Gary Oliva has confessed to the crime multiple times, actually, saying that he hurt JonBenet, that he was obsessed with her. Did he do it? My stance on that is, if they have all this DNA evidence and they know who Gary Oliva is, why would they hesitate to do anything with that? If he actually was the killer, then why are they waiting so much? Okay. Let me also give you guys something about breakthroughs in the true crime cases. You remember when the Golden State Killer was caught. We all knew it was him. You remember when the Long Island serial killer was caught. Mostly sure that it's him. He hasn't been convicted yet, right? When you see all of these news articles coming out saying the killer of JonBenet Ramsey has been identified, Gary Oliva, or the guy that snuck off to Thailand, those things are not carrying the same weight. Those types of news announcements do not have the same magnitude. When they actually find the killer, if and when, knock on wood and rich with possibility, we will most likely have a greater understanding of how this is portrayed and how this is shared by not only the media, but also by the authorities. Jim Minchell says the DNA could have been touch DNA. It could have been transferred from the person or persons that handled her undergarment in the Malaysia factory. Yes, and John Douglas does concede all of this in the book. JonBenet even had DNA that was under her fingernails, and he's like, it's possible for that stuff to transfer very easily. And even said the thing about the hair that's found could have come from someone who had used her blanket. I mean, John Douglas is fully aware. I guess him and I are in agreement. I think it's from the killer, but it's possible, right? It's not like, you just have to say that everybody's wrong. Wonderful honeybee, river prawn pottery. Now, to you guys, this episode of True Crime Talk Radio is winding down. So I wanted to ask you, though, do you have any additional observations about the JonBenet case? Do you have any other things that you would like to share? Are there any other reasons why you have the suspects that you do? Rob says he's certainly no expert. I'm not an expert either, Rob, about any of this true crime stuff. I am not, someone who's just going to act like I know everything, or that, as I said, I mean, maybe I've watched true crime on television for 30 years, but I'm definitely not, a professor of any sort, if that's what you mean. But as Anthony says, do you really think that the crime may be still solved? Yeah, I do. I do think that we will probably get answers to the JonBenet case, even if it takes 5 to 10 years. I don't think that it's going to turn into a Black Dahlia story where we simply will not know who committed the murder. I think some way somehow there will be an advancement, especially if they do have the killer's DNA. Genetic genealogical DNA testing is getting bigger and bigger. Andrew has one. When Burke was asked by the psychologist to draw a picture post crime, he didn't include JonBenet. Experts said that this was unusual. Unusual. Being unusual is also not a crime. Yeah, being weird is not a crime, or being unusual. Oh, that is also, but John Ramsey has also really wanted to address this in his numerous public appearances by stating that Burke was eliminated as a suspect very early on. Again, by the experts, by the same people who say that John Ramsey is guilty. Well, we have to agree with them when they say that Burke isn't guilty, but here's something to John Ramsey's credit. John Douglas might be right about something. Either John Ramsey's the best liar in the world or he's innocent. He goes public so many times. Almost every single documentary that I watch about JonBenet features an interview with John Ramsey. That doesn't necessarily prove or disprove anything, just saying it. Mark says, hi from Australia. A huge mistrial here in the 1980s of a mother who didn't act like a grieving mother. Are you familiar with the Chamberlain case? Dingo baby. A lesson in caution when blaming. Well, of course, the dingo ate your baby case, but I've only heard about it. I haven't really looked into that one. And yeah, people can misinterpret human behavior all the time. I will have to look more into this, and maybe we can do a follow-up. Oh, Andrew says, Mark, how about that ray gun? Oh, yes, Mark, and we have someone else here from Adelaide, Australia. Sorry you guys had to witness ray gun at the Olympics, B-girl ray gun breakdancing. Being weird is not a crime, but get that person out of here. Don't ever let her come back or something. Trained for 37 minutes for the Olympics, so she said. Oh, Anthony says, I think Ray Gun is a performance artist. Well, what I was really trying to do, Anthony, was think about Ray Gun in the sense that who would actually go through that? Do I know anybody who would actually go through with that, make that big of a mockery on the international stage? I could think of maybe one or two people that I've known personally that would actually do that and want the type of response that Ray Gun got. But breakdancing will not be back in 2028. Other than Ray Gun, I only caught two people, one other Australian. And Wallentred says, regarding experts, more than a few people convicted by expert testimony have been exonerated by DNA evidence. Wallentred, and we also have handwriting experts, right? That's what you call somebody who examines documents, right? The document examiners, they call them handwriting experts, as clear as day. You guys who follow the Zodiac case know Sherwood Morrill authenticated multiple Zodiac communications, including the Bates Had to Die letters from 1967, which have since been labeled as that of a hoaxer. I know people are going to debate that until the cows come home, but I honestly believe that Sherwood Morrill was wrong. I honestly believe that the most famed handwriting expert to ever look at the Zodiac case was wrong. And I think that that's the simplest explanation. Psychological expert this, handwriting expert that, behavioral expert this and that. Experts can be wrong. There's something that I was going to talk to you about. I was almost thinking about withholding it, but James Randi was a magician. I don't say that word too often, so I stumbled on it. James Randi was a magician who created something called Project Alpha, where he just, got some other magicians, and they were young, and, he even gave them a few pointers, but they were real magicians all the same. And Project Alpha was about trying to convince scientists that they were real psychics and they had real magical powers and they could bend forks and spoons with their mind. And he fooled them, because the point was experts can be fooled, and they're just like, no, we don't have psychic powers. This is sleight of hand, distraction, and basic psychology. And Tyler Scott says a preacher matched handwriting on a marriage license in the Zodiac case, right? Yes, that was authenticated by the handwriting expert Michael Wachsel, who's the author of the book The End of the Zodiac Killer Mystery. And That's a publicity stunt, in my opinion. But as this episode winds down for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, I will be with you tomorrow for Cooper Friday, and I will be live next Tuesday at 10:30 a.m. So you can tune in and we can talk about these true crime stories. And I love interacting with you guys and hearing what. And that will be all for me now. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always blackboxnid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you over there. Until next time.